Can you hear me?
No.
No? Yes?
No.
Should I just shout? I'm always concerned about volume. I usually can project well enough, but this is a big auditorium. So is that sufficient? Can people hear me in the back? All right, great. I want to thank everybody for having me back home. It's been 5 years since I've been to mid-Missouri. I've passed through a lot. I've been to Kansas City quite a few times and St. Louis, but mostly I've had my nose to the grindstone, finishing a book that will come out this fall with a little bit of luck in time for the end of the sesquicentennial of the Civil War and the beginning of what some historians have called, particularly in this state, the war after the war. And it's a timely moment for it, and I've only been working on the book 20 years, so I'm particularly eager to see it and see it out. And mostly, I'm glad to be home, and I call Mid-Missouri home, because I've spent so much time working in the remarkable archives and in the homes of friends like Lynn Morrill and Jim and Sue Denny and Ken Wynn, and it's good to see all of them here too. I want to thank everybody for having me back, and I'm going to talk tonight from that project that I mentioned, which is seemingly for people in other parts of the country, the Civil War is dead and gone, buried. Sort of a joke line for some. But for people in this part of the world, that's known by many different names, including the Heartland, or the Midwest, or the Confluence, or the Middle America, or what I call the Middle Border, which is really sort of the point of what I'm going to try to do tonight. The Civil War is with us in ways that oftentimes we don't even realize on a daily basis. And I'm going to try to talk about how that Civil War that we breathe and the legacies of that war that we live in imperceptible ways came out of this conflict that is very, very difficult to explain to people, which is one of the reasons it's taken me 20 years to try to explain it to myself, what happened here. So, I'm going to start. Oh, that's right. Flip this off. Here we go. I'm going to start in 1866, the year after the war ends. As if 1866, the first year after the end of the Civil War, had not been bad enough, there came the latest dispatch from one Petroleum Vesuvius Nasby. Nasby was a semi-literate inebriate, a one-time secessionist, a committed anti-war copperhead, and he hailed from the rural northeast Ohio hamlet of Wingert's Corners, comprised mostly of, in his words, white, truly democratic residents who seceded immediately from their free state, Ohio, claiming America for white men, and resolved against black immigration, and then passed an ordinance authorizing slavery. This is Nasby. They wanted the garment revolutionized to keep New England, which is spreading herself all over the West, from submerging the entire Democratic Party. Our bark was on the sea. Slavery was its anchor, its jib boom, its right forward mast, its bowsprit, its keel, its all. Rather than be drafted, Nasby enlisted and then deserted the Confederate Army, returned to Ohio, founded the Church of St. Vallandigham, and then quit the state altogether after Abraham Lincoln's and the Ohio Republicans' overwhelming 1864 election victories. After wandering several border states with divided allegiances, including New Jersey, he settled in Kentucky, in a place called Confederate Crossroads, except cross was spelled this way, for obvious reasons, which he called, quote, a typical village in the unreconstructed South. Kentucky didn't secede, and therefore within her borders, secessionists is safe. Thank the Lord for Kentucky. Well, as you might have already figured out, Nasby was a fictional character out of the fertile imagination of a newspaperman. His name was David Ross Locke. Locke was a native New Yorker who moved west in 1861 and began publishing a column in Findlay, Ohio, in the same area that Wingate Corners supposedly existed. Nasby's letters, as they were known, became a wartime sensation, gleefully skewering pro-Southern sentiment in Ohio, Locke's adopted state. Carried in serial form, it became a Western Republican staple. When introduced to the column in 1864, Abraham Lincoln reputedly claimed that, had he the author's genius, he'd swap places for the good of the country. And he personally thanked Locke for having, in his words, stirred people to right thinking and decisive action. What that meant was that Locke had solidified wartime Republican loyalism in a very divided state, and a very divided nation, and a very divided region. In October 1865, Locke moved to Toledo, Ohio, to write for the Blade. In the post-war, Locke's Nasby did as little to harmonize the West's battered landscape as he had during the war. His column's principal foil was the nightmarish violence unfolding across the Ohio and Mississippi rivers in Kentucky and Missouri. Worse there even than in the former Confederacy at the time. These loyal former slave states, exempted largely from Reconstruction measures and thereby free to defy them, were perfect representations of the violent politics of Southernization in these states. But his satirical target was the politics of white supremacy that rent his adopted state before, during, and after the war. Indeed, Nasby's villagers sent what they called, quote, a greeting to their brethren of Ohio with thanks for their prompt and effectual squelching of the idea of Negro superiority. What he meant were the angry post-war racial politics in his state that would result in Ohio rescinding its initial ratification of the 14th Amendment and its full rejection of the 15th Amendment that together gave citizen rights, including voting, to African Americans. But Locke did far more than simply satirize former rebel Kentuckians and Ohio war dissenters, or Copperheads, and Missouri Pukes, as they were often called by federal troops during the war in the post-war years. He established for his largely Western Republican readership the contours of white Southernness. That would include racial bigotry, unrestrained violence, Democratic affiliation, stultifying uneducated ignorance, and blind Confederate identity, at least from Nasby's perspective. By creating that negative reference point, Locke also confirmed for readers on his side of the rivers the contours of northernness, principled restraint from violence, abiding respect for the law, educated support for the modern order, and above all else, advocacy of emancipation of slaves and the Republican Party. These were the lines drawn by David Ross Locke and shared by many white Americans in the free states after the war. Most Americans hold that the Ohio River is a clearly defined static demographic and political boundary between the North and South that, by distinctive cultures, was an extension of the Mason-Dixon line, the fixed boundary between freedom and slavery. School children learn this scripture written as a binary, that the South lost to the North, and in prevailing narratives, the Civil War rarely serves as a defining event in the history of the West, and vice versa. Yet in this region, this Middle America, or Middle Border as I call it, part of the West, or the former West, much of this was central to perhaps the Civil War's most lasting outcomes. That is, that white residents constructed meanings of northernness and southernness, and more complicatedly, Midwesternness, surrounding the emerging debates over slavery and emancipation before, during, and after the war, and the experience of that war as much as in victory and defeat, and the discrete and often inaccurate memories of its winning and losing changed the meaning of the border, or the borderland, and with it the nation's regions. The acceptance of this new border between North and South in this region, and the mutual understandings of the new regionalism that it entailed, accomplished the nationalism that in part had spawned the war. Unable to conform either to the emergent Southern or Northern war narratives after the war, the battleground that was the West was effectively written out of that narrative, or those narratives, accomplishing the moving frontier not by conquering physical space or people, but by creating a new regional geography driven by cultural identities. The cultural politics of what I call irreconciliation would soon establish this place, this middle border, as a front for the far longer war after the war that I mentioned to begin my talk. And that was fought for nearly half a century, well into the 20th century, with internecine violence and politics, formal, informal, cultural, and ascetic. This is not purely a local story, but rather a national story seen through a regional lens, and not seen through one state, but through several states in this region. So I'm going to kind of reference the states that surround Missouri to the east in particular, often, and along the Ohio River, to make this point that Missouri was simply part of this broader change, and that the war was central to it. I'm not going to talk about the war in this talk. I'm going to pivot instead to the war's end, just as we're, in some sense, here tonight in the 150th anniversary of virtually the end of that war. In March 1865, a federal commander stationed here in central Missouri, and in one of the counties that was its slave-holding center, wrote this: "Slavery dies hard. I hear its expiring agonies and witness its contortions in death in every quarter of my district." Accomplished by different mechanisms, slavery's death in both Missouri and Kentucky triggered years of post-war violence and decades of war-driven politics. A four-way struggle raged in these states between occupying Union forces, freed people who tried to exercise the rights of freedom, white Unionists and former Confederates or their supporters, many of them disfranchised, who warred to limit them. And in both states, guerrilla violence was endemic and debilitating, and it extended past the war. Unionists in many communities called for troops to protect themselves and to support civil governments, while others begged to have the federal troops removed, especially if they were black, something that would not occur until the fall of 1865 in Kentucky and the spring of 1866 in Missouri. In truth, violence in the search for freedom drove African Americans by the thousands to cities like St. Louis and Cincinnati and Lexington, just as they had in Maryland to Baltimore. 3 of these cities have recently seen racial riots, and that's no coincidence. Louisville's black population grew by as many as 200 a day in 1865, and by 1870, St. Louis's black population had grown fourfold since the start of the war. Black men and women in St. Louis founded the Missouri Equal Rights League, comprised, unlike the Union leagues during the war, of, quote, representative colored men that sought full citizen rights, including suffrage. A year later, black Missouri veterans similarly founded the Lincoln Institute in Jefferson City, and black former Kentucky soldiers were instrumental in reforming Berea College as a biracial institution, much like Ohio's Oberlin College. Among whites in these states, racial solidarity took the form of appeals to join what was called the rebel democracy, the pejorative term loyal Unionists used for conservatives, or, as the term meant then, anti-emancipation opponents. In Kentucky, militant Confederates swept into office in 1866, the year that Nasby wrote his first dispatch, replacing the state's former Union conservatives, as they were called. This is a quote: "Those old Democrats that stayed at home are only a little less unpopular than Union men," groused one newspaperman, while, quote, "the returned rebels are the pets of the people." Even former emancipationists like Louisville's Lovell Rousseau, elected to the Kentucky legislature only the previous year, quickly converted to the democracy. The turn to a rebel democracy, as it was known, would take a little longer in Missouri, but it would also follow what happened in Kentucky. Radical Unionists had swept into power in 1864, secured control of the legislature, enacted the state emancipation ordinance before the war ended, and passed a new constitution that disfranchised former Confederates and sympathizers who were known widely as stay-at-home rebels. But racial politics quickly built steam there. In 1866, in Lexington, Missouri, a new weekly newspaper entitled The Weekly Caucasian began publishing and became a leading national voice in the resistance to Reconstruction Acts by tying the struggle of local white conservatives to the resistance efforts by those known as the Ku Klux. The advertisements for the Ku Klux, this paper ran openly. Similar white supremacist tropes called to angry Western Missourians in the pages of St. Joseph's Missouri Vindicator. This is a quote: "We are Caucasian in blood, in birth, and in prejudice," the editor blared in his first issue. In Osage County, wartime unionist Levius Zebeli refused to sign the loyalty oath required by the new state constitution, and instead he founded the Unterrified Democrat, among the longest-running newspapers currently published in the state of Missouri. The ratification of the 13th Amendment, which ended slavery, hung in the balance in Kentucky against the fall 1865 state elections, which could allow the legislature to ratify it if emancipationists should gain control. With about 65 to 75,000 slaves still held in legal limbo, many white Kentuckians refused to release them until and even after the amendment became law. And that would be by national referendum, or should I say ratification. And they employed all means of obstruction. "Take these bayonets out of the state and we'll show you whether slavery is dead or not," wrote a Bowling Green resident. In Grayson County, just weeks before the election, David C. Phillips witnessed the political assassination of a pro-amendment candidate whose son served in the federal ranks after a speech that he made. Quote, "It won't do to run men who's occupied his position at this crisis, to command the Union vote but not the abolitionist vote," wrote Phillips. Old Grayson is right on this question. I found out in the middle of research for this book that was my Kentucky ancestor. So I know how my family stood on that question. It was a little sobering to read. On election day, many federal garrison commanders and militia commanders refused to prevent disloyalists, former Confederates, and even known guerrillas from voting. And election judges certified the votes in districts where secession flags hung inside of polling places. Defiantly rejecting federal authority, after the national ratification of the 13th Amendment in December 1865, Kentucky's legislature defiantly repealed its 4-year law of expatriation that had disfranchised former Confederates and now refranchised them. Kentucky would not ratify the 13th Amendment until 1976, 111 years after slavery's de jure end. The only state that was slower to do it was Mississippi in 1993. Former Confederates and former guerrillas and paroled Confederates, chafing under their defeat, as one wrote, waged overt racial warfare throughout the former slaveholding areas of both of these states. In some towns, gangs of paroled Confederates still in uniform murdered freed people and warned others to leave or die. Others proclaimed their gangs of night riders as regulators or Negro regulators or just Ku Klux. And they fired into private residences and they taunted unionists. This is a quote. "Some of those men say they intend to kill the last Negro soldier that comes into this county. All of this class of men are returned rebel soldiers," wrote this person. In western Missouri, Jim Jackson's former guerrilla band threatened entire towns with mass slaughter if all black residents didn't leave the state. And a garrison commander in Warsaw, Kentucky noted that, quote, "Negroes coming from the interior are forced to cross the river into other states." One black immigrant driven out of Kentucky by violence in 1865 remembered this: that Ohio sure looked pretty. Communities witnessed virtual reenactments of the late war in both Missouri and Kentucky. Lines of self-described Southern men exchanged shots with self-described Union men, often former Confederate soldiers, while, quote, uncompromising Union men and peace-seeking former Confederates alike found themselves beset by mobs of self-described lynchmen. And according to one observer, midnight intrusions, no house is safe outside town. At Russellville, Kentucky, Unionist residents suffered returning Confederates who, according to one, dress and parade the streets in their Confederate uniforms, fully armed with revolvers, and constantly fire weapons, especially at night. Those Unionists who did fight back, like Frankfort, Kentucky's John Marshall Harlan, were often terrorized from their homes. The irony of this is John Marshall Harlan would be the only dissenting voice in the famous Plessy versus Ferguson case on the U.S. Supreme Court that entrenched segregation as the law of the land. He had actually left the Army in protest of emancipation. As a recently returned Indiana soldier claimed, quote, "Killing a guerrilla is called murder in the vocabulary of Kentucky Copperheadism, but the radical Union men may as well dig their own graves if they haven't done it politically already." Vowing, and this is a quote, that they'd been treated like dogs by the people long enough, many of these federal soldiers, white and black, struck back by organizing paramilitary union leagues or calling themselves union regulators. Midnight wars resulted, as one frightened resident wrote, with opposing forces, often in uniforms, quote, "trying all the time to kill each other. They waylay the roads for each other." By wide margins, both of these former slave states soon rejected the 14th and 15th Amendments, and their national ratifications, especially the 15th, which allowed black voting, unleashed racial frenzies in each of them. During the first election, allowing African Americans to vote, potentially to correct the wrongs of slaveholding past, what one Kentucky resident called the Black Peril, saw armed state militias recruited by the state intimidate black voters from exercising their new political rights. Fueled by rumors of what they called Negro Ku Klux companies raising, battalions of what were called citizen guards mustered into the Kentucky National Legion and fought alongside paramilitary Klan groups on election day, reenacting the war against often armed black voters during the next two election cycles. In Missouri in 1874, the rebel democracy regained power in the state. And 2 years later, during the National Centennial, 1876, a constitutional convention overturned the prescriptive radical or Drake 1865 Constitution that had included an ironclad oath that had prevented voting by former Confederates and sympathizers. Predictably, former Confederates swept into state offices, including its former rebel governor, Thomas Coate Reynolds, I'm sorry, that's not him, who served in the state legislature, and he helped to elect two Confederates, former Confederates, a general and a senator, to the U.S. Senate. Both of them would serve there for the next quarter century. In 1884, less than 2 decades after the war's conclusion, John Sappington Marmaduke, the former Confederate general, assumed the governorship. By then, Kentucky had seen a full decade of former Confederates holding its highest office. Now, across the river in the free states of the West, or the Middle Border, a different form of post-war warfare ensued. Racial animosity and violence was apparent, but subsumed within war-driven party politics. Former slaves surged across the rivers to these free states, particularly the cities like Evansville, Cairo, Illinois, to Cincinnati. And most lower Ohio River counties saw their black populations double or even triple by decade's end. Racial hostility in these states portended a realignment of their southern counties with former slave state neighbors as the national debates entwined the laden terms Negro question and Southern question. At Cairo, Illinois, with its once contraband camp now bursting with almost 3,000 freed people, the post commander wrote this: "The prevailing sentiment among the white population of the city is disloyalty to the government and extreme hatred of free Negroes." In Cincinnati the following spring, the new newspaper, Colored Citizen, a black newspaper, reported attacks on black veterans by recently returned white federal soldiers. Indiana's Democratic Copperhead legislature ratified the 14th Amendment, but it did not repeal its black immigration law, as had Illinois the year before, making it the nation's only former free state to keep racial exclusion laws on its books. It would not allow black people to move in. More than harsh racial realities in these states, the politics of wartime sacrifice in them largely blunted the chance for a Southern-style democratic redemption after slavery, as in neighboring former slave states, Kentucky and Missouri. War triumphalism overrode Democrats' negrophobic rants, as they called them, as Republicans effectively used emancipation and support for it, and support for the Reconstruction Amendments, as a purity test for post-war loyalty, and tarred Democrats as Confederate traitors. In Indiana's fall 1865 elections, one editor clucked this: "Copperheads had no ticket. They're played. The shadow of the Negro is not large enough. The undying democracy have died, wiped out, as clean as the Great Rebellion." Well, not quite. These politics in those free states manifested themselves at the state level as fierce contests that mirrored the wartime divisions, and in turn they deepened the political animosities carried over from the war. Unlike in the states across the rivers to the south, this political struggle for home rule soon became known, with different meanings, as the Bloody Shirt. At the state level, less to promote black equality than to torment Democrats, Illinois' and Ohio's Republican-controlled legislatures quickly ratified the 13th Amendment and repealed their state's black laws, save for suffrage prohibitions. They would not let blacks vote. At the national level, Republican and Democratic congressmen used war wounds as weapons. But Western Republicans also drew sharp racial limits to this Union triumphant trope, often refusing to embrace even minimal political rights and social privileges for African Americans, which made the East a very different place than the West. Federal veterans led this new political warfare, and in turn they benefited from it. Commanded by the Union's great triumvirate, Westerners, Ohioans, Ulysses S. Grant, William T. Sherman, Phillips Sheridan, men who had led their armies, Western armies, to victory by a hard style of war. Well, many of these veterans returned home with deep enmity for those who had either not supported or who had outright opposed their cause. copperheads. Quote, men cannot go through a prolonged emotional crisis and not pay the price, admitted one Illinoisan. It makes people hysterical. Although prevented by their officers from exacting full vengeance on Southerners, meaning in the Confederacy, after the war, newly christened Lincoln Avengers now abused what they called home rebels, and they eschewed affections of reconciliation. Federal officers turned partisan Republicans like Illinois' Robert Ingersoll, Ohio's James Garfield, who would later be president, of course, told veterans this: every scar you have on your heroic bodies was given you by a Democrat. You think our politics today are bad? Federal veterans, particularly those bearing wounds, and veterans organizations, men's and women's, were universal presences at these party political rallies, and they helped Republicans maintain control of these state legislatures for as long as a quarter century. Democratic veterans coined the term Loyal West to construct a narrative that at once claimed victory and denied slavery as a cause of the war, in protest of radical Reconstruction. Voting like they shot, federal veterans drew down on these Democrats in electoral warfare as closeted Confederates. Virtually all Republican candidates at the local, state, and national level were themselves federal veterans, usually officers. Democrats often were unable to contend in these states, leading one to splutter this: 100 soldiers of the late war have more influence politically in any community than 200 citizens who never robbed hen roosts or masticated hardtack in range of rebel guns. From 1868 to 1900, every Republican presidential candidate but one had a military record. 5 of them were Ohioans, the first being Grant, the federal war hero, who was elected in 1868 by wide margins in all of these states, 3 states. As wartime loyalty offered currency for post-war sacrifice, daily political warfare in local communities saw Unionists, women and men, hurl epithetic terms rebel and copperhead at former dissenters to bar them from church membership and communion. In Hamilton, Ohio, Republicans took aim at Democratic school teachers, who they called Northern rebels, whose active sympathies are unblushingly given to treason. Local partisanship, uniformed and not, quickly manifested itself in insults and lawsuits and business boycotts and threats of or outright violence. Singing anti-copperhead songs, as one Ohio music instructor learned by anonymous letter, quote, "Well, get your damn nose broke. I'll be at your singing, and if I hear that song, down goes your meat house." I'm not quite sure what that meant. But we can only speculate, right? Many of them were Democratic veterans who claimed that they too had fought and bled for a just cause, the Union as it was, and returned home unrepentant. In once Southern sympathizing Williamson County, Illinois, dozens of men died in post-war feuds that followed war loyalties and service and non-service. Because women actively participated in this partisan political warfare, they were little spared. A, quote, female teacher, expressive of the wish that Grant, Sherman, Lincoln, and others would take the cholera and suddenly die, was dismissed when she, quote, vowed she should not carry a Union flag to the proposed picnic of the scholars, but that she intended to carry a rebel flag. Imputing disloyalty, Republican newspapers gleefully published the name of local female recipients of wartime dead letters sent to slave states, impugning their loyalty. The pervasive post-war violence raging through the neighboring former slave states caused many to ridicule their reputedly discreet, superior white cultures. Quote, Southern women, like Southern men, have fallen from grace, and nothing short of Reconstruction will save them. Racial politics fueled retributive violence in rural areas and middle borders former free states, especially during and after the 15th Amendment debates, suggesting a conservative alignment with neighboring former slave states. Borrowing from the Western region's long tradition of racial subordination, regulators, as they were called, or whitecaps, lynched local black miscreants throughout the former Copperhead regions, southern Illinois, southern Indiana, southern Ohio, and southern Iowa, increasingly targeting African Americans as vestiges of the war's emancipation outcome. One historian has found 80 whitecappings in just 2 Indiana counties in the 20 years after 1873. Many of them called themselves Ku Kluxers, and they had migrated during or after the war from neighboring slave states like Missouri, Kentucky. Quote, during the late war and towards its close, many left Tennessee and Kentucky and brought with them the relics, the practices indulged in throughout the South, an Illinois editor noted. One former Kentucky slave, Nancy East, living in Middletown, Ohio, remembered, quote, never heard nothing about Ku Klux at all till we come up here, and they had them. Posses and militia on several occasions were called to quell mobbings and often met armed resistance from Democratic war veterans. Their vigilantism now blended with war partisanship. At an 1872 Ku Klux lynching of 2 white men jailed for rape near Van Wert, Ohio, members of the mob offered, quote, 3 cheers for Jeff Davis during the hanging. Illinois witnessed at least 20 murders in its southern counties, led by what was called Bloody Williamson, the state's once Confederate and Copperhead capital. The county's name, as one resident wrote, became to Republicans, quote, a hiss and a byword. In the years to come, nearly 3 decades of what one historian has called commemorative separatism allowed cultural politics by discrete white, southern, and northern myth-making to explain the wartime sacrifice of what's estimated now to be about 750,000 people, to complete the cultural border that would redefine this former West as the North, the South, and the Midwest. Commemorative civic rituals, such as cemeteries, monuments, veterans encampments and reunions, as well as organizations among loyal Union triumphalists, especially Republicans north of the Ohio, and former Confederates and sympathizers of what is known as the Lost Cause audiences below these rivers, generally Democrats, fueled popular literature in the form of stilted memoirs, county histories, novels. They created mutually exclusive communities and counter-narratives in which Ohioans and Indianans and Illinoisans were judged to be uniformly loyal, which they hadn't been, and Kentuckians and Missourians were even more uniformly disloyal, or Confederates. Erased from these war memories were dissenters in the West, like Clement Vallandigham, the one who Nasby formed the church in celebration of, who's remembered now only by Edward Everett Hale's biting anti-dissent short story, Man Without a Country. The majority of populations of white and black Unionists in these former slave states who served in the federal ranks and maintained support of the wartime Union, they are remembered, not the ones who opposed the war. What had occurred in the half-century after the war in the West former borderland were discrete inversions of Prussian military theorist Karl von Clausewitz's famous dictum that war is politics by other means. In fact, in these states, white residents employed politics as other means to achieve war goals. Wars of sorts had raged between wartime communities of allegiance writ large. Through racial politics, although racial politics have driven the engines of dissent, despite similarities of racial discourse and ideology that span the rivers, white residents above and below them forged discrete war legacies by defining distinct political identities. The war's realities were appropriated to rewrite war narratives, to conform with or oppose the war's national outcomes. Petroleum v. Nasby's genius was manipulating cultural aesthetics to influence formal politics, in this case to anti-slavery Republicans' advantage, a process that also was in work in these former slave states in inverse, with pro-slavery Democrats the ultimate victors. But winning these wars, and they were complicated, took a half a century. But they fully divided these former free and slave states who had once mostly fought on the same side in that long ago War of Union. War dissenters, especially in the rural areas, were largely bypassed by post-war northernization in places like Cleveland and Milwaukee and Indianapolis, and especially Chicago, who benefited from economic nationalism as an engine of victory and transformed the upper portions of these states. In the lower portions, former rural butternut portions of the free states, a variant emerged in complement with that loyal West narrative that said that we won the war, but we didn't win it for slavery or to end slavery. And it complicates this north-south binary. Rather than accept their rural areas as northern, rural residents of these places, particularly the free states, were inflicted with insecurity during this intense struggle over nationalism and traditionalism in their parts of their states. Small-town editors like Emporia, Kansas's William Allen White sought to coin the term Midwest in order to capture or to instill tropes of pastoralism, social progress, independence, democratic egalitarianism, civic virtues. But it was also in these very areas, even in the area surrounding White's hometown of Emporia, where I used to teach, and in these lower and river counties of what was once the West. This was the epicenter for resurgent white supremacy, and it bore witness to conservative racial traditions in the form of black exclusion laws, sundown towns, and white cappings. And during the second incarnation of the Ku Klux Klan, its strongest membership and national leadership hailed from a former butternut state north of the Ohio River, Indiana. Rather than denote an absence of region, which the Midwest is often referred to as, the term Midwest reflects a yet unreconciled intra-regional contest over the meanings and broader outcomes of the Civil War. Western Kentucky offers the apotheosis of the entwinement of Civil War memory and this newly created Southern identity. In Fairview, the birthsite of Confederate President Jefferson Davis, today stands an obelisk made of concrete, 351 feet high, dedicated on June 7, 1924. An estimated 10,000 people attended, including many former Kentucky Unionists and federal veterans, and they witnessed the dedication of what the famous writer and poet Robert Penn Warren, who was from that region, remembered in his childhood as, quote, a faint white finger pointing skyward. Only months earlier, as the finger was nearing completion, the local Ku Klux Klan had burned a fiery cross on the spire's yet unpeaked top. The unmistakable physical and symbolic presence announced that this former contested ground south of the Ohio River had been claimed for the Southern Confederacy and for the South. The stretching shadows of the former Middle Border's forgotten Civil War have proven persistent and complicated. Exploiting historical events and understandings, marketers employ border war imagery to lure collegiate sports fans to athletic contests between state universities in Kansas and Missouri, just north of here, and then between Missouri and Illinois. Rather, they call it the bragging rights, mainly because it's played in St. Louis. Both Kentucky and Missouri and their state institutions, their state flagship institutions, are eager members of an intercollegiate athletic conference whose identity rests almost exclusively on these states' former affiliation with the long-dead Southern Confederacy. So too in these states, primary and secondary school mascots have war-born cultural names such as rebels and cavaliers and colonels, while north of the rivers find its complement, rail splitters, generals, and farmers. At Bardstown, Kentucky, the Federal Hill Mansion, former residence of a Pennsylvania-born judge, and this is the centerpiece today of the Old Kentucky Home State Historical Site. It's referred to as being the inspiration for Stephen Foster's famous plantation song. This latter-day plantation, as it's called now, it was called a farm then, along with others across the river from Cincinnati and these states, welcome visitors to their state's genteel southern past, including generous hospitality and a benign narrative of slavery. One of the great ironies, of course, is that song that Stephen Foster reputedly was inspired to write, My Old Kentucky Home, is now Kentucky's official song, state song, and it reflects the lament of a slave sold south to Louisiana. Aversion to Southern cultural perceptions influenced public representations of the war and of this region north of the river. In the 1990s, for example, the school board of a north suburban Cincinnati district, created in the 1950s and now fast growing, voted to build simultaneously two identical new high schools. And it soon faced a naming problem. Although the land tracts for the schools lay directly, several miles directly north and south of one another, the board chose to name them Lakota East and West, largely because the parents whose children would attend the southernmost school pressured the district's board, not wanting the negative cultural stigma of the designation Lakota South. And as the parents said, and it was reported in the papers, we're not sending our kids to the dumb school. Since the 1930s, billboards in southern Illinois beckoned tourists to the state's infamous old slave house, owned by former slaveholder John Crenshaw and known as Hickory Hill. I remember seeing it when I was traipsing back and forth between Illinois and Georgia for graduate school. All these signs quickly came down when in 2000, Illinois' Historic Preservation Agency at last acquired the property that had been trying to get for decades, promising and having to sign that they would not tear it down and that they would restore it as a historical site. The embarrassed Illinois State Legislature promptly closed the house to the public, and it remains closed, citing budgetary reasons. Also remaining closed is the most glaring reminder of the land of Lincoln's long-forgotten history of slavery, which did not end in the state of Illinois until 1850. As travelers whiz through Cincinnati, only the elevated sign announcing the corporate home of the Western and Southern Insurance Company reminds them of the transitory nature and meanings behind American regions and of this former borderland along the Ohio River. If they continue traveling farther west, they will cross the Mississippi River at St. Louis, and travelers cannot avoid the massive arch billed as the gateway to the fill in the blank. West. But only a few miles farther west in Missouri on I-70, they will be greeted by signs advertising that they have entered Little Dixie. The moniker for the state's former slaveholding center since the political renaissance in the 1880s. More recently, another legacy of unreconciled outcomes of a long-distant war have manifested themselves on this reputed border between freedom and slavery. That is, again, racial violence. In Cincinnati in 2001, in Ferguson and St. Louis, Missouri in 2014, and now in Baltimore, Maryland, 2015. Plus ça change, plus c'est la même chose. The more things change, the more they stay the same. Politics are destiny. High, low, social, racial, economic, cultural, aesthetic, identity. This is the most recent Confederate monument built in the state of Missouri to Joe Shelby, famous Confederate cavalryman located in Waverly. I was passing down on Route 54 today, and I saw a sign for Boulevard Beer, and it said, "The taste of the Midwest." And I had to stop and remind myself that Boulevard's a proud Kansas City product, and that in the years after the Civil War, Kansas City became the epicenter of Confederate commemoration in the state of Missouri. And that's where Joe Shelby is buried, and where all of his soldiers or his officers are buried around him, in a kind of a Confederate shrine. And I am reminded again of the complicated legacy of that war and of our understandings of this region or regions because of it. Among the bitter fruits of the Civil War and its aftermath in this former middle border was a struggle for ownership of new definitions that masked successive unreconciled conflicts before, during, and after the war about the meaning of that war. The border that now defined them was completed only after the political culture of sectional moderation that defined the West was replaced with the angry cultural politics of regionalism. The former middle border region that had long assimilated slavery and freedom into a unique white Western identity was vanquished by antagonistic cultures of slavery and abolition under new names: Southern, Northern, and Midwestern. Loss as much as victory defined this new regionalism on all sides of these rivers. Less overwhelmed by outside forces than driven by internal conflicts framed against competing organized principles known as sections, the West, this place of multiplicities, imagined as individual and national ambitions, was again pushed on by politics. In its place, there would be two regions, maybe three. Two core communities created by exclusivist politics that imagined as much as they'd experienced the war. The national confluence, the middle border, that once represented as the West, was remade as North, South, and more complicatedly, Midwest, symbolized by its now wide rivers. Change starts at the margins, but it's completed in the middle. Thanks for being so patient.